We're going to review chapter 1 today. So the first thing we talked about in chapter 1 were just some vocab terms, statistics being the science of data, and then data analysis is the whole process of kind of looking at all of those numbers and summarizing it and displaying it in a meaningful way. So two vocab terms that you want to make sure you're familiar with. Individuals, remember, is not just referring to people, but it could be people, animals, objects that the experiment or data is collected from. And then the variable is the characteristic of that individual. Remember, the variable doesn't correspond to the values. The values of the variable are those outcomes. The variable is the more broad or general category. So we have two variable types. We've got categorical variables that put individuals into a category or a group, and then quantitative variables, which are number values where it makes sense to find an average. Remember, sometimes number values are actually categorical. So something like grade level would be categorical even though it's a number. And then we can examine the distribution of a variable by making a graph and then following our set of descriptors. So really the distribution is just telling us what our outcomes are and how often we see those outcomes. So if it's a categorical variable, we can talk about maybe the most common eye color and the least common eye color. If it's quantitative, we can talk about the shape of that distribution. We can talk about the maybe average SAT score, the overall variability of SAT score, and whether or not we have any outliers. So I talked about the kind of cycle that we're looking to complete in this course. So we have this population that we want to make some claims about, but usually we can't access the entire population because it's too costly or too time consuming or both. So instead we select a representative sample and collect data from that sample. Once we've collected our data, we're going to analyze it. So for right now, really, we just know how to graph that data and describe and crunch some of the numbers if it's quantitative, but we'll go further with that in later chapters so that we can make an inference or a claim about the population based on what we see in our sample. If we have categorical variables, we can graph those with either a pie chart or a bar graph. And so really those are the only two types of graphs that would be appropriate if our data is categorical. Remember that when we make our graphs, you want to label everything. Those are important. And if it's a bar graph, you're going to leave space between the bars. Also with the bar graph, the y-axis starts at 0. So if you're looking at two categorical variables at a time and you want to examine whether or not there might be an association between them, we can organize that with a two-way table. So the two-way table just gives you a row variable and a column variable, and then gives you the count of individuals that fall into each group. Then you can examine the marginal and conditional distributions of those variables from the two-way table. So a marginal distribution just examines one variable at a time, where a conditional distribution examines both variables together. So under the condition that they're in a certain group, what does the distribution of the other variable look like? We talked a little bit about the four-step process being the state, plan, do, and conclude. This isn't something that you'll have to do on this chapter test, but in future chapters, we will be using that four-step process. And I'll talk more about it for each specific procedure that we do. But again, state is just a restatement of the question. Plan is, what are you going to do to answer that question? So what kind of graphs are you going to make, or what kind of numerical summaries are you going to provide? And then the do step is that you're actually going to carry out your plan. And then conclude is that you conclude in context. And so the context piece is really important. Even when you're doing your descriptions of socks, for example, we always want to make sure those are in the context of the problem. So keep that in mind for kind of all of your open-ended tasks in this course. If you have a quantitative variable, we can graph those with either a dot plot, simplot, or a histogram. And then in section 1.3, we added that box plot in as well. And then you're always going to describe with socks. Remember, when you describe your socks, you're going to use sentences. and make sure it's in context. And then as far as your shape goes, remember when you're describing particularly symmetry, use those LY words, so roughly symmetric or approximately symmetric. We've got our skewed to the right and skewed to the left. Remember, you also had your bimodal distribution, which is where you had two peaks, or you had your uniform distribution, where everything's uniform or the same throughout. So when you're describing the socks, we just saw the shape on the previous slide. When you describe your measures of center, you should describe either the mean or the median and use the appropriate symbols. So remember, your mean is X bar, and that's just the average. You're going to report the mean if your distribution is roughly symmetric with no outliers. Your median is just the middle number. You're going to use the median if your distribution is skewed or has outliers. We don't really have an abbreviation for the median. You can use a capital M or you can say MED. Symbol here with median is not as important as it is with the mean. We want to make sure we're reporting as X bar. For measures of spread, we can use our standard deviation, again, symbol being important, so that's S sub X. We use the standard deviation if the distribution was roughly symmetric with no outliers, so if we were using the mean. We use the IQR if our distribution was skewed or has outliers, so we use it in paired with the median. Remember, the IQR is Q3 minus Q1. So really at this point, we should not be using the range anymore to describe a measure of spread because the range is a little bit misleading, particularly in cases where the distribution is skewed or has outliers. As far as these measures go, you should be able to interpret in context. So standard deviation is the average or typical deviation from the mean. The IQR is that middle two quartiles. So you're looking at the middle 50% of the data set. You can use the IQR to check for outliers. So it's the 1.5 times the IQR rule. So remember, this is where you're going to take Q3 plus 1.5 times the IQR and Q3 minus 1.5 times the IQR. Anything within that range is considered reasonable. Anything outside of that range is considered an outlier. So there is an optional assignment in your textbook, and I'll post the answers for that if you want to do some or all of it, and then check your work. And then you will have your Chapter 1 test tomorrow. So your Chapter 1 test is going to be 10 multiple choice questions, 2 free response, and you'll submit the multiple choice just through multiple choice on the computer, and then your free response you'll upload digitally like you have with the past 2 quizzes.